So I'm here today with Father Brian. Father Brian is from Flushing, New York, the elder of two, graduated from Holy Cross High School in 2003, went on to attend the University of Our Lady, Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. In 2004, he joined the, what was it called?
Old College.
The Old College Seminary program. Yeah. So, and then you graduated in 2007.
Correct.
And obviously went on to become a deacon, then a priest, is that right? And I think you received your current rectorship, rector of the Basilica of the Sacred Heart here on campus in 2019.
2015.
2015,
No,
oh,
take
sorry.
it back. Yeah, 2019.
Assistant rectorship as...
The year before.
Okay.
Old College in 15. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for joining me. So just a little bit about the premise of the show. It's really an interview in the form of a game, with questions that are intended to be provocative. I found them on the internet about various things. Sure. And the objective is you'll read the question first, and they're from a pool of questions, and they're shuffled, so I don't know which one's going to come up next. And that's kind of an essential part of the show because it's about thinking on your feet and being able to answer it with knowledge that you have instead of being able to prepare for it. So you'll read the question, and then I'll try and give my best answer, and I'll ask you whether or not I'm a heretic. And you'll let me know whether or not I'm a heretic, and also what a good Catholic response would be.
Sure.
All right. So I'll line up the cards for you, and you can just draw the first one.
This is giving me some flashbacks. I spent this semester studying in Belgium, and the only means of assessment in that school was one 20-minute oral exam at the end. And this is how they gave you the prompt. There was like 12 prompts, and you just picked one from the deck.
That is chaos.
How do you define God?
That is a tough one to start with. That's very tricky. I think first and foremost, the words truth, being, goodness, the epitome, the most good, the highest good, or truth itself. But I don't mean to be too vague either, because I also think God is defined as the creator. One thing I would say is I'm pretty sure the fact that it's a capital G God question is pretty important. So I would also define God as almost any value. I don't want to break it down too much by analogizing to something else, but I think you can make a God out of almost anything if you really wanted to. I think you could absolutely worship the gods of Greek mythology without knowing that you do or meaning to. Just for example, you have Dionysus or something, and there's millions of people who celebrate Dionysus without thinking the word Dionysus. But when we use capital G God, it's the greatest of all gods. All gods are below him. And almost like the highest possible value. I think that's the best I can do with that question. So I'm going to have to ask you, am I a heretic?
I think your question may have set yourself up for a little bit of failure here. So I would not say you're strictly a heretic, but I think you're trying to get at steps 4, 5, and 6, jumping over step 1, which I think is very natural for people of faith to do, because we like to define things. We like to have characteristics and traits and whatnot. And that's good, and God has all of those things. What's easy for us as Christians to forget, especially Christians who go to a place like Notre Dame and who study theology and are engaged in the life of the mind, we forget that God is first and foremost a person, more than a set of ideals, more than a set of values, more than a set of attributes, and because God is a person, he is sort of undefinable in the way that any person is undefinable. It would be awkward for me to say, like, define Charles or define Elizabeth. It would be because a definition sort of is inherently limiting. So I think the question of how do you define God is important, but the basic and most fundamental premise is that he is inherently undefinable because he's more than just a set of parameters. He is the creator of the world. He is the one who loves us and loved us first. He is the one that sang the world into being. And so we can know all of these things about God and derive traits, characteristics, definitions about the highest good. That's an excellent one. But all of those are, like, we need to remember that those things don't exist in the vacuum. They exist in the fact that they define a real, true, living, existing being in the persons of the Trinity, exemplified in the love of the Father, the love of the Son, the love of the Holy Spirit. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it does. I think a couple questions come to mind. So I'll start with the one that I hope has a shorter answer. In the Old Testament, I believe God gives Moses something the closest to what, like, spoken word has to God's name. And when people translate it to English, they say something along the lines of, like, I am who am, or I am the one who am. What's going on with that? Why? It's very confusing. And I think sometimes with language slip, because words continue to mean different things over time, that, like, even the first time when it was translated into English, it could be interpreted differently, hundreds of years later, even in the same language.
I think it's helpful for us to put ourselves in that context, right? The relationship of the people of Israel to God prior to the time of Christ is a unique relationship. It's a relationship of trust and belief, right? They are his chosen people. They are his privileged people. They are the one with whom he made the covenant. He brought them out of Egypt and delivered them from the grasp of Pharaoh. But it's a relationship that is always inherently mediated, right? Like, their relationship with God exists in the relationship with the law, because the law of Moses is the thing that they have closest to God's gift to them, and given to them in a very concrete way. It's mediated through sacrifice. It's mediated through the Torah and the Pentateuch, the law. We forget sometimes that our relationship with God inherently looks different precisely because he decided to sort of break that barrier by entering our world, taking our form, taking our flesh, and being one with us. We have no problem using the name of God because he's given it to us. He is Jesus, and he calls us to know him by name, and to walk with him as a friend and a brother, right? And that would sort of be completely out of the rational mind of someone living in the time of ancient Israel, So I think for them, it's trying to express this, like, what does this word capture in our understanding of God? And that's hard, and it's hard for us to understand that framework precisely because we live in a post-resurrection world, a world where the Son of Man entered into our being and made himself and revealed himself to us, like, in our flesh and in our flow. What does all things, visible and invisible?
It's very fortunate that this question came up next, because I think this was something I was interested in asking about on the previous question when we were defining God. So one of the questions I encounter a decent bit on the internet is something along the lines of, how you define existence. Like I run into some materialists who argue some really radical points, in my viewpoint, that things that don't have matter don't exist or something like that. And to me, it would appear that things like heat, and light, which are measured to be not matter, do exist because they're measurable. So I think we have evidence to believe that things that are invisible exist. Something else that comes to mind is a question: why use good materials to build a beautiful church? So I think the answer is something like this. You want to make a beautiful church to do several things: direct our attention towards God, honor God, glorify Him, and also practical examples of having images of saints and stories. I mean, we have the Stations of the Cross in every chapel. And in modern times, we could very easily replicate some of the greatest cathedrals of the world much more rapidly. I mean, obviously, it's still an incredible challenge to rebuild Notre Dame in Paris, but it's a lot easier now than when they were building it originally. And we could replace it with materials that look the exact same but are much cheaper. And it very reasonably could make no difference. I mean, we're approaching a time when technology can produce things that are cheaper and perform the exact same. But I think the church wouldn't use such materials because it's not about making the most economical church in pursuit of beauty. It can function the exact same and from the outside be perceived as almost precisely identical, especially if it's something way up high, You're not really interacting with it. Why does the painting need to be hand painted by someone? Why couldn't you use a stencil and fill the whole thing? And you very easily could, or robots and whatnot. And I'm sure in a lot of situations we do need to. And there's plenty of churches that don't have the capital to build it. But when we do have it, we do. And I think that speaks to exactly what this question is talking about, is that it's not visible that the material is any different, but it is different, and you know that it's different, and God knows that it's different. And I think that's a lot of what the visible and invisible in the prayer refer to, and I think it's also a great metaphor for the Eucharist as well, because observably it is still the same, but it is different. So, am I a heretic?
No, Charles, you're not a heretic.
That's great.
That's a good thing. But I think you're getting at what the church is getting at, in that there are things that we can understand, perceive with the human eye, which is visible. There are things that we can understand without the benefit of the human eye. Heat, can't see heat. You can sort of feel heat, touch heat, but it's not visually observable, and in that sense, it's invisible. The same is true for kind of the analogy of, as a stone is replicated to look like stone. The human eye perceives one thing and may perceive them as the same, but doesn't. They are the same. So let me suggest, if we take your framework and back it up just a little bit, that the question of God creating all things visible and invisible it's less about that which is visually observable and not observable, but it's really more about that which is known and unknown.
Okay.
Right? So, for example, God created the atom, the substance of life, the building block of life. That atom was invisible to humankind for millennia, and only until recently do we understand what it looks like, how it operates, and can observe a cell, for example. Is a good reason. Like, we have only been able to visibly observe what a cell looks like in the past 100 years. Does that mean it was not created by God? No, it means that it's always been created by God. It's always been part of God's existence. Our ability to observe it and know it and understand it has changed. But our ability to know something isn't what limits God's creation.
So I don't mean to oversimplify, but it's something akin to a tree fallen in the forest with no one around is definitely fallen.
Right. Exactly. So God creates all things, that which is known to us, and that which is unknown to us. Now, the benefit of hindsight is that we can easily talk about cells and atoms and all these sorts of things because we've discovered them. What's harder for us to understand is what we haven't discovered yet.
Right.
What 100 years from now might be readily apparent to someone that's not readily apparent, understandable to us, but it's still part of God's creation. So to say that God created all things, visible and invisible, means even the stuff that we don't know about yet, even the stuff we don't quite understand or grasp, even the stuff we don't have the ability to actually see, all of that is still within the realm of God's creation. And is still part of his creation. And is still part of his life. Because what he has created transcends what we know and what we can observe and what we can understand. Which I think is a fundamental statement of truth every time we say the creed. Right? Let me take that to the church analogy. That's a very important question, a good question. There's no right or wrong answer. I mean, there are plenty of examples of churches kind of being built using different materials because it's more cost effective. I mean, the Basilica is actually a prime example of this. And if you go to all the churches that look like the Basilica in France, they're all made of stone. Mm-hmm. They all took centuries to build, and they're all pretty cold, and they're all well decorated, but the expense was significant, both in time and money. The Basilica is made to look like those churches, but it's made of plaster and wood and paint. So in fact, I was just at a beautiful church this weekend, St. Hyacinth, Chicago, and if you look into it, when you walk in, it looks like it's made of marble, but what it is just painted plaster to look like it's marble. So, we've certainly used that tactic before. Of course. I think what's important to say is to always understand what the object and goal of the space is. There are times when it's more fitting to use a more expensive and time-consuming method of production and labor. Certainly, the architects and engineers at Notre Dame de Paris are dedicated to using the original methods for any number of important reasons. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that something that's made with more cost-effective materials is somehow beneath the Lord. But we just want to be thoughtful about making sure that we're using them in a manner that helps the human soul glorify God and come to know God.
That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, I'll take the top one. Why are there differences between the Eastern and Latin rites?
All right, this one you got me a little bit on. Okay. I have it somewhere in the archives. I've learned about this material for sure. From what I understand, there's definitely some politics involved for why there are still major differences. I think there was something along the lines of Christotokos and
Theotokos.
Oh yes, and it's something like whether or not Mary's Son of God and Son of Man, or Jesus is the Son of God and Son of Man. And from what I understand, is in Judaism, in the Old Testament time period, there were several that claimed to be the Son of God. Mm-hmm. But Jesus was the one who claimed to be the Son of Man. God become flesh. And I don't really understand why that was a real issue point. And I suspect that there are many other political layers involved. I know there's some differences that still exist, such as leavened bread versus unleavened bread, which I think is supposed to represent either the haste with which the Israelites left, or I think the other one, the leavened, is to is something like what we were talking about with the materials in the churches, where it's supposed to represent all that God has given us. Um, I think there's a few other differences. I know they're really big on icons over there. I don't think I'm at risk of being a heretic on this one because I haven't really said enough.
Yes.
So perhaps I should have extended myself more, but I'll just leave it to you. I think you know.
Yeah, these are not entirely issues of belief. Some of them are related. Uh, Everything you've said is correct. There are parts of this element, but what I'm going to do is take it one step further back. But the reason why they're the Eastern rites, and there are a number of them, there are 27 sui juris churches, one of which is the Latin rite, we know as the Roman rite, which is predominant in the West. The reason why they exist is because the church grew up and developed in multiple locations across the known world at the time without the benefit of easily and readily accessible communication. And so Thomas goes to one place, and John goes to another place. Peter and Paul famously go to Rome. Someone goes to Antioch, someone goes to Constantinople. There's no central office. There's no dicastery putting out, here's what we believe on the Tuesday, and here's how we're going to celebrate all these things. They're all, through the grace of the Holy Spirit, kind of making it up as they go. As the apostles, they are proclaiming what they know to be true of Jesus Christ from their experience, and building up churches around them. Naturally, they're going to differ in practice because not everyone's going to do everything exactly the same. Naturally, there will sometimes also differ in belief because the way they come to think about God is going to well up differently. And the goal of the ecumenical councils was to bring all of those groups together and say, wait, time out. Let's make sure we're all on the same page with the core beliefs. Who is Jesus? Is he God? Is he man? Is he both? What does that mean for Mary? Is she the Christ bearer, the Christotokos, or is she the God bearer, the Theotokos? And that's a statement on who Mary is, but also more importantly, a statement on who Christ is. And there were certainly knockdown, drag-out fights at many of those councils about people espousing their different rationales for why one was more rational and logical than the other.
Could I interject?
Sure.
Could you expand a little bit on why they care? I feel like you're like most Christians who just go in the U.S. who just go to the Latin Rite. I don't really know. I'm definitely not getting out of bed because of the Christotokos. Why is it so important? And perhaps it was I understand why it's important to have the same foundational beliefs, but why is that one so? What's the big difference between the two beliefs?
The belief it has to do with Mary's place in the church. Did she carry only the human portion of who Christ
portion,
for lack of a better term, or did she carry the totality of who Christ is? Because Christ is also God. Does that make her the mother of God, or the mother of just Jesus Christ? Right? And this was eventually ironed out. We all now say she is the Theotokos. Right? We refer to her as the mother of God, and also the mother of the church, because we the Council Fathers discerned that, and guided by the Holy Spirit, that Mary couldn't just bear a portion of who Christ is. Mary had to bear all of who God Christ is. And if Christ is the second person of the Trinity and the Son of God, she must be also the bearer of God. And that changes the way we think about Mary. It changes the way all the churches think about Mary. So that's not a division. That was different churches coming with different understandings and then having to forcibly come to a common understanding. Right? Today, those divisions mostly have to do with language and practice. So we worship in English.
Mm-hmm.
Prior to that, prior to the council, we would have worshipped in Latin.
Right.
Right? The Melkites worship in Greek. The Maronites worship in Syriac. The Syro-Malabars worship in some Southeast Asian kind of Indian dialect. Um, their practices are kind of more regionally specific. They use different liturgies that were developed in their own spaces and times. Their vestments look a little bit different. Those things, I don't think they should excite us to get up. They cause us to like get up and to huff about those things, but they're important to say that this is where we were raised, and this is why it's culturally important to us. I think our attachment to that in the Latin Rite is a little bit different because the Latin Rite quickly became the rite of the places that inhabited other places to be polite, and thus became disassociated from like the Roman experience.
That makes sense.
Now, if you're a Greek Melkite, though, like it is very much part of being home. It's part of being Lebanese, right? And our students who go to the Melkite Rite Mass here at the University of Notre Dame do so because it is culturally important to who they are as Greek Melkite Catholics, as people of Lebanese descent. The same is true for the Syro-Malabars. The same is true for the Maronites. There's a much stronger in those Eastern traditions affinity between like regional culture and the religious practice and ritual practice.
So I have some questions about like the state of the church now.
Okay.
I read with God in Russia, and he lived in America and learned the Latin Rite when he was here, but then his commission was to Russia during, obviously, the leading up to the Second World. I mean, his story's ridiculous. But he learned the like Russian Eastern Rite. So there's like unity between like you can just. Have you ever is it possible for you to celebrate the?
So you need to have
Eastern.
Yeah, it's possible. Yes, you need to have permission. You have to have permission from your own rite to say that you need faculties in the other rite, and you have to actually learn it, right? So I would need to learn a fair amount of Greek in order to celebrate the Byzantine style rites.
Of course,
the Melkites. We need to learn Syriac to celebrate the Maronite rites. Some they have English parts of them now and whatnot. But in the cases of need, yes, the church allows you to have what they call bi-ritual faculties. Which allow you to celebrate Mass in your own right, but also participate in Mass in another. So a very clear example of this is Father John Paul Kimes, who is at Notre Dame Law School, who is a Maronite Catholic priest, whose home liturgy and rite is the Maronite Rite, who also celebrates the Latin Rite with some regularity at the law school. Because he's been given the permission to do both.
That's awesome.